name is Hurtado Bronzi, a hetman, which is to say a senior captain of the Geno 52 Chilean Imperial Army, glory of terror, beloved of the Emperor. I'm an Edessa-born man, proud of my liberty, Catholic by devotion, a brother to 2 sisters and a brother. My ears hear only the orders of my estimable Lord Commander, Namat Jira. My hands know only the purpose of the Emperor and the correct business of a carbine laser. My mouth, well, my mouth knows a great deal more and knows when not to say it. Because he has taught us to be scrupulously secretive. No, I will not be drawn to say his name. I said he has taught us to be scrupulously secretive. That is his way, and we love him for it. The greatest gift he has bestowed on us is to share his secret with us. Why? Because we were there, I suppose, at Tel Utan and Monlo Harbour, and now the Shivering Hills. If it hadn't been us, it would have been others. Why are you whispering? I can hear you whispering. What don't you want me to hear? What secrets are you plotting? Pain? Is that it? Is that all you have to offer me? Well, yes, it does open secrets. Some mouths. What have you planned for me? Ah, I see. Well, if you must, I won't welcome it. What will it be? Eyes? Genitals? The gaps between my toes and fingers? First, you should know... Oh, merciful. Quite the expert, your little man. Quite the expert. He's done this before, hasn't he? No, wait. Beloved terror. Ah, shit. A little bastard. Let me finish, please. Let me finish what I was saying. Please? Yes? All right, then. This won't work. This simply won't work, because I'm telling you it won't. I will not tell you anything. It doesn't matter what you do to me. Really, it doesn't. Burn me all you like. My mouth is shut. Because that's all he asks of us. The only thing, I can tell you who I am and who I was, but I can't, I won't betray his confidence. Oh, shit! Holy fire! Bastard! What? Ask what you like. Burn me again if you must. My name is Hurtado Bronzi. That's all you're getting. Part 1. Reptile Summer. Chapter 1. Tel Utan, North, 2 years before the heresy. The Nerthine uttered some of the usual gibberish before he died. He pointed at his enemies with his dust-caked fingers and jabbered, spitting out curses on their families and dependents, and particularly miserable dooms on the heads of their children, far away. A soldier learns how to ignore insults. But there was something about the Nerthine way of cursing that made Sonika blanch. The Nerthine lay on his back on a slope of dry red sand where the blast had thrown him. His pink silk robes were stiffening in places where his blood was drying rapidly in the late afternoon sun. His silver breastplate, with its engraving of stylized reeds and entwined crocodilia, winked like a mirror. His legs lay in a limp position that suggested his spine was no longer properly connected. Sonika trudged up the dry bed of the wadi to inspect him. A terribly dark, terribly blue sky met the red horizon. The sinking sun picked up the facing edges of rocks and boulders with a bright orange sheen. Sonika was wearing glare shields, but took them off out of courtesy, so that the Nerthine could see his eyes. He knelt down, the small gold box around his neck swinging like a pendulum. "Enough with your curses. All right," he said. The troops stood around him on the slope, watching, their weapons ready in their hands. The desert wind brushed their embroidered waist-length coats and made them flutter. Lon, one of Sonika's Bashors, had already snapped the Nerthine's falx with his licknight and flung the broken stump away over the rim of the wadi. Sonika could still smell traces of the licknight spray in the warm air. "It's over," he told his enemy. "Will you speak to me?" Looking up at him, grains of sand stuck to his face, the Nerthine murmured something. Bubbles of blood formed at the corners of his lips. "How many?" Sonika asked. "How many more of you are there in this sink?" "You," the Nerthine began. "Yes, you. You are carnal with your own mother." At Sonika's shoulder, Lon raised his carbine sharply. "Relax, I've heard worse," Sonika told him. "But your mother is a fine woman," said Lon. "Oh, now you lust for her too?" asked Sonika. Some of the men laughed. Lon shook his head and lowered his carbine. "Last chance," said Peto Sonika to the dying man. "How many more?" "How many more of you?" replied the Nerthine in a dry whisper. His accent was strong, but there was no denying that the Nerthine had mastered the imperial language. "How many more? You come from the stars in your droves, and you do nothing." "Nothing?" "Nothing, except prove the universal presence of evil." "Is that what you think of us?" Sonika asked. The Nerthine stared up at him. His eyes had gone glassy, like the sky at dawn. He burped, and blood welled up out of his mouth like water from a borehole. "He's dead," observed Lon. "Well spotted," said Sonika, rising to his feet. He looked back at the men gathered on the slope behind him. Beyond them, 2 Nerthine armored vehicles were burning, sweating soot and smoke up into the blue sky. From the other side of the wadi, Sonika could hear sporadic las shots. "Let's dance," Sonika said. From the rim of the wadi, looking west, it was possible to see Tel Yutan itself, a jumble of terracotta blocks and walls capping a long loaf-shaped hill 10 kilometers away. The intervening landscape was a broken tract of ridges and ancient basins, and in the sidelong evening light, the basins had filled with shadows so black they looked like pools of ink. Sonika felt a comparable blackness in his heart. Tel Yutan was proving to be their nemesis. For 8 months it had held them at bay through a combination of terrain, tactics, stoicism, and plain bad luck. The Geno 52 Chiliad was one of the oldest brigades in the Imperial Army. An elite force of 1,000 companies, it had a martial tradition that stretched back through the time of the Great Crusade and into the era of the Unification Wars that had preceded it. The Geno was a proud member of the Old Hundred, the strife epoch regiments that the Emperor, in his grace, had maintained after unification, provided they pledged loyalty to him. Many thousands of others had been forced to disband, or had been actively purged and neutered, depending on their level of resistance to the new order. Peto Sonika had been born in Feodosia, and had served in his youth in the local army, but he had petitioned eagerly for transfer into the Geno 52 because of their illustrious reputation. He'd been with the Geno for 23 years, achieving the rank of hetman. In that time, they hadn't met a nut they couldn't crack. There had been tough dances along the way, of course there had. Off the top of his head, Sonika could mention Phoetium, There they had slogged toe to toe for 6 weeks with the greenskins in lightless, frozen latitudes. And Xantium, where the dragonoid cadres had almost bested them in a series of running battles and ambuscades. But Nerth, Tel Yutan in particular, was as stubborn as anything they'd ever met. Word was the Lord Commander was getting edgy, and no one wanted to be around Namat Jira when that happened. Sonika pulled his glare shields back on. He was a lithe, slender man of 42 years standard, though he could pass for 25. He had a striking, angular head with hard cheek and jawlines, a pointed chin, and a generous, full-lipped mouth full of gleaming white teeth that women found especially attractive. Like all of them, his skin had bronzed in the Nerthine light. He made a signal, and his bashors brought the troops in along the rim of the wadi and down into the dry basins beyond. Geno armor followed them, bounding along on their treads and spuming wakes of red dust behind them as they churned out across the basin floor. Sonika's centaur was waiting, its engine revving, but he waved it on. This was a time for walking. There was half an hour of daylight left. Night, they had learned to their cost, belonged to the Nerthine. Sonika hoped to run his troop as far as the forward command post at CR-23 before they lost the light. The last tangle with the Nerthine had slowed their advance considerably. Dislodging them from this country was like pulling out splinters. Sonika's troops looked very fine as they strode forwards. The Geno uniform was a bulky, tight-buckled body glove of studded leather and armor links, with a waist-length cape of yellow murdercaxi, a Terran silk, much rougher and more hard-wearing than the pink silks of the Nerthine. The ornate leather armor was marked with devices and trimmed with fur, and the backs of their capes were richly embroidered with company emblems and motifs. They carried lightweight packs, munition slings, long sword bayonets, and the bottles of their double water rations, which clinked against the lignite cylinders they had all been issued with. Standard weapons were They were all big men, all genic bred, and selected for muscle. Sonika was slight compared to most. Their headgear was spiked helms, either silvered steel or glossy orange, often edged with brims of fur or neck veils of beaded laces. The glare shields were goggle-eyed, bulbous, paired hemispheres of orange metal with black slits across them. Sonika's troop was coded the Dancers, a name that they'd owned for almost 800 years. In those last few minutes of daylight, the Dancers were going to take the worst beating they had ever known. "So who's that?" asked Bronzy quietly. "Do you know?" Bashor Che, busy with the wrapper of a ration, shrugged. "Some kind of something," he grunted. "You're a world of use. You know that," Bronzy replied, punching Che in the arm. The Bashor of the regimental uterine stock, and considerably bigger in all measurements than Bronzy, gave his hetman a tired look. "Some kind of specialist, they said," he volunteered. "Who said?" "The Uxor's aides." The Jokers had reached the CR-23 forward command post about an hour earlier and had been billeted in the eastern wing of the old brick-built fort. Chart Referent 23 was a Nerthine outpost captured 2 weeks before and lay just 8 kilometers from the Tell. It formed part of the noose that Lord Commander Namat Jira was tightening around the enemy city. Hurtado Bronzy, a 60-year veteran possessed of boundless charisma and a stocky body going to seed, leaned out of the billet doorway and took another deliberate stare along the red brick passageway. At the far end, where it opened out into a central courtyard, he could see the newcomer standing in conversation with Honan Mu and some of her aides. The newcomer was a big fellow, really big, a giant dressed in a dust-grey mail sleeve and a head shawl, with a soot-dulled bolter slung over his shoulder. "He's a sizable fugger, though," said Bronzy, idly toying with the small gold box dangling on the chain around his neck. "Don't stare so," Che advised, gnawing on his bar. "I'm just saying, bigger than you, even." "Stop staring." "He's only where I happen to be aiming my eyes, Che," Bronzy said. Something was going on. Bronzy had a feeling in his water. Something had been going on for the last few days. Uxor Honan was unusually tight-lipped and had been unavailable on several occasions. The man was big. He towered over Honan, though everyone towered over her. Even so, he had to be 220, 225 maybe. That was gene-build big. Astartes big, even. Honan was looking up at him, craning up, nodding once in a while at a conversation Bronzy couldn't catch. Despite the fact that she was conferring with a giant, Honan's posture was as tenacious as ever, spiky and fierce, like a fighting cock, full of vigor and attitude. Bronzy had long suspected Uxor Honan's body language was a compensation for her doll-like physique. Bronzy looked back into the billet hall. His jokers were busy sacking out, drinking and eating, playing bones. Some of them were cleaning off weapons or polishing armor scoops, wiping away the red dust that had slowly caked on during the long day in the field. "Think I might go for a little stroll," Bronzy told Che. The Bashor, munching, simply stared down at the hetman's feet. Bronzy was still fully armored, but he'd taken off his boots when they'd arrived. His thick, dirty toes splayed out through the holes in his woolen socks. "Not cutting a dash?" Bronzy asked. Che shrugged. "Well, fug it." Bronzy pulled off his embroidered cape, his webbing and his weapon belt, and dumped them on the baked earth floor. He kept hold of his water bottles. "I just need a refill," he said. Bronzy padded out into the passageway, his water bottles dangling from his pudgy fingers. He was disappointed to see that the giant had vanished. The Uxor and her aides were heading away across the courtyard, talking together. Honan turned as Bronzy wandered into the yard. The air was still warm, and the day's heat was radiating out of the shadowed brick. Evening had washed the sky overhead a dark, resiny purple. "Hetman Bronzy, was there something you wanted?" she called. The words came pinging out of her mouth like tiny chips of ice. Bronzy smiled back amiably and waggled the empty water bottles. "Going to the pump," he said. Uxor Honan pushed through her waiting aides and came towards him. She was such a tiny thing, built like a girl child, compact and slight. She wore a black body glove and a grey wrap, and walked on heeled slippers, which served only to emphasize her lack of stature. Her face was oval, her pursed mouth small, and her skin so very black. Her eyes seemed huge. At 23, she was exceptionally young, given her level of responsibility, but that was often the way with Uxors. Bronzy had a bit of a thing for her. So perfect, so delicate, so much power emanating from her tiny frame. "Going to the pump?" she asked, switching from low Gothic to Edessan. She often did that. She made a habit of speaking to the men one-on-one in their native tongues. Bronzy supposed these displays of linguistic skill were meant to seem cordial, while emphasizing her formidable intelligence. Where Bronzy came from, Edessa, funnily enough, that was called showing off. He switched with her. "For water. I'm out." "Water rationing was done earlier, Hetman," she said. "I think that's just an excuse to be nosy." Bronzy made what he hoped was a lovable shrug. "You know me," he said. "That's why I think you're being nosy," Honan said. They stared at one another. Her enormous eyes slowly travelled down to his stockinged feet. He saw her fighting a smile. The trick with Honan was to appeal to her sense of humour. That was why he'd left his boots off. Bronzy tried to hold his stomach in and still look natural. "Hard, isn't it?" she smoked. "What's that now?" "Holding that gut of yours in?" "I don't know what you mean, Uxor," he replied. Honan nodded. "And I don't know why we keep you around, Hetman Bronzy," she remarked. "Isn't there a mandatory fitness requirement anymore?" "Or a weight threshold," suggested one of her aides, four blonde teenage girls who gathered around Honan with wry smiles on their faces. "Oh, you may mock me," Bronzy said. "We may," agreed one of the aides. "I'm still the best field officer you've got." Honan frowned. "There's some truth in that. Don't be nosy, Hurtado. You'll be told what you need to know soon enough." "A specialist?" Honan shot a questioning glance sidelong at her aides. She reached out to them with her sept, too. They all looked away, recoiling from the touch of the scolding sept, concentrating on other things. "Someone's been talking," Honan announced. "A specialist, then?" Bronzy pressed. "As I said," Honan answered, turning her attention back to him. Yeah, I know," said Bronzy, rattling his water bottles together as he gestured. "I'll know when I know." "Get your men settled," she told him, and turned to go. "Are the dancers in?" he asked. "The dancers?" "They should be in by now. Peto owes me a payout on a wager. Are they here yet?" Her eyes narrowed. "No, Hurtado, not yet. We're expecting them soon." "Oh," he said. "Then I request permission to take a foray team out on a ramble to find out what's keeping them." "Your loyalty to your friend does you credit, Hurtado, but permission is not granted." "It'll be dark soon." "It will. That's why I don't want you rambling around out there." Bronzy nodded. "Are we clear on that? No clever or ingenious misinterpretations of that order forming in your mind this time?" Bronzy shook his head. "As if." "They'd better not be. Good night, Hetman." "Good night, Uxor." Honan clicked away on her heels, sending out a command with her sept. Her aides paused for a moment, scowling at Bronzy, and then followed her. "Yeah, stare at me all you like, you blonde bitches," Bronzy murmured. He padded back to the billet. "Jay." "Yes, Het." "Get a foray team up and ready in 10 minutes. Che sighed at him. "Is this sanctioned, Het?" he asked. "Absolutely. The Uxor told me personally that she doesn't want some fug-fingered ramble blundering around out there, so tell the boys it's going to have to be sharp and professional, which will make a change for them." "Not a ramble?" "I never ramble." "Sharp, Che, and professional. Got it?" "Yes, sir." Bronzy pulled on his boots and redressed his weapon belt. He realized he needed to take a leak. 5 minutes, he told the Bashaw. He found the latrine, a stinking cement pit down the hall, unbuckled his armor, and sighed as his bladder emptied. Nearby, men were showering in the communal air baths, and he could hear singing from one of the other troop billets. "You'll stay put tonight," said a voice from behind him. Bronzy tensed. The voice was quiet and hard, small yet powerful, like the supergravity coal of a dead sun. "I think I've finished what I'm doing, actually," he replied, deliberately not looking around and deliberately keeping a tone of levity in his voice. "You will stay put tonight. No fun and games. No bending the rules. Are we clear?" Bronzy buckled up and turned. The specialist stood behind him. Bronzy slowly adjusted his stance until he was looking up at the man's face. Terror. He was huge, a monster of a man. The specialist's features were hidden in the shadows of his dust shawl. Is that a threat? Bronzy asked. Does someone like me need to threaten someone like you? The specialist replied. Bronzy narrowed his eyes. He was a lot of things, but timid wasn't one of them. Come on then, if you want some. The specialist chuckled. I really admire your balls, Hetman. They were only out because I was taking a leak, said Bronzy. Bronzy, right? I've heard about you. More barefaced cheek in you than all the asses in the Imperial Army. Bronzy couldn't help but grin, though his pulse was racing. I could mess you up, son. I really could. You could try, said the specialist. I would, you know. Yes, I have a feeling you might. Don't. I'd hate to damage a friend. Let me be clear. There are things going on tonight that you must not mess with. Don't let me down by pissing around. Don't get involved. You'll understand soon enough. For now, right now, Hetman, take my word on this. Bronzy kept his stare going. I might trust you if I could see your face or know your name. The specialist paused. For a moment, Bronzy thought he was actually going to pull down his shawl and show his face. I'll tell you my name, he said. Yeah? My name is Alfarius. Bronzy blinked. His mouth went dry. He felt his heart pounding so fast it trembled his torso. Liar. You liar. That's a pile of crap. A sudden brilliant flash made the chamber blink white for a second. A deep reverberative boom reached them. Bronzy ran to one of the slit windows. Outside, in the dark, he could see the flashes and light blooms of a major battle flaring behind the ridge. The percussive crump and slap of explosions rolled in. One hell of a firefight had just kicked off along the Wadi Rim, less than 10 kilometers away from the post. It was concussive, bending the air, bending sound. Behind Bronzy, men were rushing up, scrabbling around the windows to see out. There was chatter and agitation. Everyone wanted a look. Peto, Hurtado Bronzy murmured. He turned away from the window slit and the rippling light show, pushing his way back through the mob of men to find the specialist. But the specialist had already vanished. The world had come off its hinges. For the first few seconds, Peto Sonica thought his company had been caught up in some sort of freak hailstorm. Thousands of luminous projectiles were raining down out of the twilight into the basin, like spits of fire or a cloudburst of little shooting stars. Every one exploded in a searing fireball as it impacted. The overpressure was knocking men to the ground. Sonica reeled as fiery detonations went off all around him like grenades. The bang of the first few impacts had deafened him. He saw men thrown, burning, into the air by blooming flashes. He saw 3 of his company's tanks quiver and then explode in wickering storms of shrapnel fragments as the sizzling pyrophoric deluge struck them. It wasn't a freak hailstorm. Despite the Dancers' scouts and recon, despite their Auspex and Modar, despite their careful deployment and marching cover, despite the omniscient monitoring of the expedition fleet in high orbit, the Nerthine had surprised them. The Nerthine were of a tech level several points down the scale from the Imperium. They possessed guns and tanks, but still favored blades. They should have been easy to overrun. But from the opening actions of the expedition war, it had become clear that the Nerthine had something else, something the Imperium entirely lacked. Lord Commander Teng Namakjira had described it in a moment of infuriation as air magic. The name had, perhaps unfortunately, stuck. Air magic was why Nerth had held off the might of an Imperial army expedition for 8 months. Air magic was why a Titan cohort had been decimated at Tel Cortec. Air magic was why a 6th Torrent Division had disappeared into the desert sink at Gomanzi and never returned. Air magic was why nothing flew above Tel Utan, why every attempt to destroy the place with airstrikes, missiles, orbital bombardments, and troop drops had failed, and why they were being fought. The elements obeyed them. They were casters in of devils. A shockwave threw Sonika over on his face. He had blood in his mouth and sand up his nose. He rose on his hands, and Bashor Lon came running out of the flashing air. He was yelling at Sonika. Sonika could see Lon's mouth working, but he heard nothing. Lon Impossible, Lon yelled. What? Much up to the fucking idiots? The hail suddenly ceased. Blinking around at the devastation, Sonika heard snippets of the abrupt quiet, too. Blurts of crackling fire and the screams of men, cut up and mixed with baffling, numb seconds of profound deafness. "Oh, fug!" Lon cried, suddenly awfully audible. The Nerthine were on them. Nerthine infantry, called Ekvenerth, swarmed out of the shadows and pits of the enclosing night and poured into the firelight. Their swirling pink robes and silver armor shone in the flames. Their falxes whirled. Several of them carried aloft kite-tailed banners showing the water reed and river reptile badge of the Nerthine royalty. The falx was an astonishingly proficient and barbarous weapon. 2.5 meters long, it was essentially a hybrid spear, a scythe straightened out. Half its length was a straight hand grip, the other half a long blade with a slight bias hook, the inside curve of which was razor sharp. Spinning and sweeping a falx like a flail, an expert Ekvenerth could lop off limbs and heads and even bisect torsos. The blades went through almost any metal. Only lignite could break the blades, but it was impossible to use it in combat. Lignite canisters came out when the fight was done to neuter the fallen weapons of the enemy. A spray of liquid nitrogen froze the metal brittle so that it could be shattered underfoot. Ekvenerth rushed at them from the ditches of the sink. The first dancers they met were scythed down by the long whirling blades like tall corn. Arms and heads flipped into the air. Arterial blood squirted. Truncated bodies fell like sacks. A few carbines fired, but it was hardly a proper reply. Sonika started running forwards. "Wake up! Wake up!" he howled. "Gun them down! Use your guns! Don't let them in!" They were in already. The night sand was littered with Geno corpses and body parts. There was a fine haze of blood in the warm air. Sonika could taste it. His hearing was back, and his ears were filled with the hiss and chop of butchery and the screams of his men. He kept running. He fired his carbine one-handed, drawing his sword bayonet in the other. An Ekvenerth ran at him, and Sonika blew his face off. The man cartwheeled backwards. A falx swung, and Sonika sidestepped, kicking its owner's feet out from under him so that he fell on his back. Sonika ran the Nerthine through with his bayonet. He dropped on one knee, raised the carbine to his shoulder, its barrel resting on the fork of his blade grip, and picked off 2 more of the charging enemy with aimed shots. Their pink robes trailed out as they crashed backwards. Lon was beside Sonika, along with 3 other men, firing in sustained bursts. Their shots made bright darts in the air. Ekvenerth toppled and fell, one on fire, another with his ribcage blown wide. "Dancers! Dancers! This is the Dancers!" Sonika yelled as he fired. "CR-19! We need help here! Immediate! Major incursion!" Stand by, dancers, he heard an Uxor's voice reply. We are aware. Retasking units to your position. Now, Sonika yelled. Now, we're being slaughtered! One of the men beside him suddenly fell sideways, split in two from shoulder to groin. Pressurized blood escaped in all directions at once. Sonika wheeled and saw an Ekvanerth spinning his falx back from the blow to strike again. Sonika slashed with his sword bayonet in an attempt to block. The long blade of the falx, just a blur of blue metal in the violet twilight, went through Sonika's hand in a line across the base of the thumb, severing his fingers, his thumb, and the upper half of his palm, and snapping the grip of his sword bayonet. The blow was so clean that there was no pain at first. Sonika staggered backwards, watching the thin sprays of blood jetting out of his ruined hand. The falx circled again, tracing a glitter in the air. It did not land. Another falx blocked it. Blade struck blade, and the attacking falx shivered away. A dark figure slid into view and killed the Ekvanerth with a single explosive shot. The newcomer was a huge brute, done up in a dark mail sleeve, his head and shoulders swathed in a shawl. He carried a falx in one hand and a bolt gun in the other. He looked down at Sonika. Courage, he said. Who are you? Sonika whispered. Lon had run to Sonika's side. Get this man's hand bound, the big man told the Bashaw. He turned back to the fight, rotating the falx expertly in his left hand like a baton. He wasn't alone. As Lon wrapped his hand, Sonika saw that a dozen anonymous men had entered the fight, coming out of the darkness like phantoms. Each one of them was inhumanly large, his face hooded in a desert shawl. Each one carried a bolter and a falx. They moved with a speed that was not human, and struck each blow with a force that was not human. In a matter of minutes, they had carved the heart out of the Ekvanerth attack. Their bolt guns roared and pumped like thunder, blowing pink silk and silver into blood-caked pieces. Astartes, Sonika gasped. Stay with me, Het. Stay with me, Lon whispered. There, Astartes, Sonika said. You've lost a lot of blood. Don't go to sleep on me. I won't, Sonika promised. Those men, those things, they're Astartes. Lon didn't answer. He was staring at the horizon. Holy terror, he whispered. Tel Yutan had caught fire. Honan Mu watched the city burn from an upper window of the CR-23 post. Every once in a while, a building cooked off and blew out in a streamer of fire. Rising smoke hazed the clear night sky. Her aides winced and oohed at every snap of flame. She could feel their responses through her sept. She nodded, finally. May I inform the Lord Commander? You may, said the specialist, waiting behind her. I will make a report to him personally, of course, but you should have the pleasure of transmitting this news to him first. Honan turned from the window. Thank you, and thank you for your work. Nerth isn't done yet. There is much to do, the specialist told her. I understand. The specialist hesitated, as if he slightly doubted this. Our paths may not cross again, Uxor Honan Mu, the specialist said. There are two things I want to say. The Emperor protects is one of them. The other is a word of admiration for the Geno 5-2. You have bred good soldiers in the finest genetic tradition. You ought to know that the old genic legacy of the Chiliads was an inspiration the Emperor acknowledged in creating us. I didn't know that, said Honan, surprised. Ancient history, pre-unification, said the specialist. There's no reason you should. I must go now. It has been a pleasure making war with you, Axor Honenmu. And with you. Though I still don't know your name. I am Alpha Legion, lady. Given your septive powers, I think you could guess it. The specialist left the post through the back halls, walking through shadow. He moved silently and quickly. Near the north gate, he stopped in his tracks and turned slowly. "Hello again," said Hurtado Bronzy, stepping out of the darkness with his carbine aimed at the specialist's chest. "Het, my compliments. That was a genuine feat of stealth." Bronzy shrugged. "I do what I do." "Can I help you?" "I do hope so," said Bronzy. "Does that thing have to be aimed at me?" "Well, I don't know. I feel a lot more comfortable like this. I want some answers. I have a feeling only gunpoint is going to get them for me." "Gunpoint will simply get you killed, Het. All you need to do is ask." Bronzy bit his lip. "You've taken the tell, I see." "Yes." "Fancy work. Kudos to you. Did it have to cost so many lives?" "Meaning?" asked the specialist. "I heard the dancers got cut to ribbons tonight. Was that part of your plan?" "Yes, it was." Bronzy shook his head. "Fug, you admit it. You used my friends as cannon fodder and—" "No, Het. I used them as bait." "What?" Bronzy's hands shook on the grip of the carbine. His finger tightened on the trigger until it found the biting point. "Don't look so shocked. Life is all about secrets, and I'm prepared to share one with you. Honesty is the only really valuable currency. I'll tell you this truth on the understanding that you trust me." "I can do that," said Bronzy. "The Nerthine are quite toxic in their power. No conventional assault was going to break them. They are possessed by chaos. Though I don't expect you to know what that word really means. My men needed to get into Tel Yutan, and that meant forcing the Nerthine into a distraction. I regret that your friends, the dancers, were the ideal choice, tactically speaking. They drew the main force of the Nerthine aside, so we could enter Tel Yutan. I did ask my men to spare and protect as many of the dancers as possible. That's honest, I suppose. Brutal, callous. We live in a brutal, callous galaxy, Het. Like for like is the only way we can deal with it. We must make sacrifices, and no matter what others say, sacrifices always hurt." Bronzy sighed and lowered his weapon a little. Suddenly, it wasn't in his hands anymore. It was bouncing off the far wall, broken in two. "Never aim a weapon at me again," said the specialist, suddenly in Bronzy's face, pinning him against the wall. I won't." "Good. Are you really Alpharius?" Bronzy gasped, aware that his feet were swinging in the air. With his free hand, the specialist pulled back his shawl and allowed Bronzy to look upon his face. "What do you think?" he asked. When Sonika woke up, flocks of Kazavak flyers were dropping into the flame-lit ruin of the basin, wing lamps flashing. The whole night was lit up by the burning doom of Tel Yutan. Sonika looked around blearily. His hand hurt like a bitch. Air crews were bundling the walking wounded and the stretcher casualties up the ramps of the waiting ships. Sonika looked up at Lon. "How many?" he asked. "Too many," said a voice. 3 dark figures stood nearby, like a tragic chorus. They were silhouettes in the firelight, their bolters slung across their bodies, their shawls drawn up. "Too many, Het," said one. "We regret their loss," said the second. "War requires sacrifices. A victory has been achieved, but we take no pleasure in your losses," said the third. You're Astartes, aren't you?" Sonika asked, allowing Lon to help him to his feet. "Yes," said one. "Do you have names?" Sonika asked. "I am Alpharius," said the first. Sonika inhaled hard and dropped quickly to one knee, along with Lon and the other Genomen. "Lord, I am Alpharius," said the second figure. "We are all Alpharius," said the third. "We are Alpha Legion, and we are all one." They turned and walked away into the billowing smoke. Chapter 2. Visages, Nurth, 5 weeks later. They retired and spent the last of the summer at Visages, playing bones and other games, sitting out in the heat. Some of the men rode servitors off into the veldt and hunted big game, while others broke the local livestock and raced them up and down in the dust. Visages was simply their name for it, officially called CR345, or Tel Kut in the local dialect. It was a cluster of dwellings in a northern wadi, where the ground was littered with broken diorite heads. Some were as large as tank wheels, others as small as beads. No one knew who had carved the faces, or why they had done so in so many contrasting scales, or why the sculptures had been smashed and the heads alone scattered as spoil. Nor did anyone care. There was wine sent as a reward for their pains by Namatjira, and peck in bountiful quantities, courtesy of the same source. They diced and raced and gambled, played spheristiki, laughed out their pain, and swam in the warm blue pools hidden in the cliff-face caves. Sonika's hand healed. Field surgeons had cut back the wound and packed it with basal sensors and motor plugs so that it could later accept a machine graft. He flexed it every day and sensed fingers that had been and would be again, interim phantom fingers. There was a rumor that the Nurth war was ending, and they would soon make shift for a new zone. Sonika didn't believe it. He sat around in the Visages billet with Dimitar Shiban, a Trinacrian-born Het who had been injured in the same week as Petter. The flesh of Shiban's chest and neck was swollen and knotty with buried shrapnel. Like Sonika, he owned a deep hatred of the Nurthine's weaponized magic. "I have been dreaming lately," he said one day, as they sat around on an awning-covered terrace. "In my dreams I hear a verse." They had each sniffed a pinch of peck from the gold boxes around their necks, and Sonika was pouring wine from a Gombrun-ware ewer. "A verse, huh?" asked Sonika. "I'll tell you how it goes, shall I?" "You remember it, then?" "Don't you remember your dreams, word for word?" Shiban asked. Sonika thought about it, then shook his head with a smile. "Never," he said. Shiban shrugged. "Fancy that," he said. "This verse," Sonika prompted, sitting back to sip his wine. It goes, "From the hag and hungry goblin that into rags would rend ye, and the spirit that stands by the naked man in the book of moons, defend ye." Shiban broke into laughter as soon as he had finished his rendition. Sonika looked at him. "I know that," he said. "You do?" chuckled Shiban. Really? My mother used to sing it to me when I was a boy. She called it the Bedlam Song. There were other verses that I now forget. Really? What does it mean? Sonika shrugged. I have no idea. Shiban's company was coded the Clowns, and their banner was a howling skull, clad in white and rouge vaudevillian grease paint. Shiban had been hurt by a Nerthine splinter bomb during a Wadi fight east of Tel Yutan, and he'd been obliged to leave the Clowns under the field command of his head Bashor, a man Sonika came to know as Fugging Strabo. As in, I hope that Fugging Strabo is keeping his head, and beloved terror, let Fugging Strabo not be getting my poor boys killed. You worry too much, Dimmy, Sonika told him. Oh, so you would be happy leaving your troop in the hands of your Bashors, would you? Sonika empathized. Due to the bad mauling the dancers had taken, the entire company had been retired to visages, injured and healthy alike. Shiban, however, had been sent north with 30 or so wounded of his clowns, the rest of the company deemed intact enough to continue operations. Sonika wondered how he would have felt if he'd been forced to leave the dancers with Lon. He trusted Lon with his life, Shah and Atix too, all the dancer Bashors. Still, he appreciated Shiban's edginess. They were sitting feet up under the awning in the late sun of an endless afternoon. They were playing the head game, a pastime of their own devising. A man ran up the dusty slope towards them, a clown, stripped to the waist, red-faced and sweating from too much exertion in the sun. He saluted in front of the two reclining officers. Sirs. Hello, Jed, said Shiban. Let's see it. The clown, Jed, held out a diorite head. It was chipped and incomplete, about the size of a grapefruit. Sonika really missed grapefruit. Shiban looked at Sonika. Sonika raised a considering eyebrow. Put it in place, Jed, Shiban invited. The clown walked across the hot sand in front of the awning, panting hard, and bent down over the line of heads laid out in the sun. They were arranged in graduating size, seed and pea-sized at one end, fist and apple-sized at the other. The head Jed had brought was clearly the largest. He set it down triumphantly at the end of the row. Point, clowns, said Shiban. Sonika nodded graciously. Get a cup, Jed, said Shiban, and the clown ran off eagerly to help himself to the cold wine on the stand behind them. Shiban took a pinch from his gold box, sniffed, and sat back. He sighed. The low's good, he said, but I miss the combat fix. Sonika nodded. Shiban had a face like a monkey, with a long brow, a long upper lip, and a button nose. His tanned forehead was high, and his long white hair poured down off the back of his head like a cascade. The shrapnel bumps covering his throat and chest were the sort of thing a man couldn't ignore. The warty mass was quite fascinating. The medics had drained and lanced some of them, but the rest, they had advised, would work out in time. He looked like he had a goiter of blisters. As he had told it to Sonika, Shiban had surprised a Nerthine war party in the business of planting bombs. During the firefight that had resulted, the Nerthine had set the bombs off, killing themselves and wounding Shiban and his men. Some of that shrapnel was organic. Some of it was Nerthine bone. I hear there's fighting at Monlo, Shiban said. I heard that too, said Sonika. Another man ran up. It was Olmed, a dancer. He held out the head he was carrying. Place it, said Sonika. Olmed took it to the line. His diorite head was bigger than any of them, except the one the clown had just placed. Adjudication, Shiban called. The Munitorum aide emerged from the cool gloom of the doorway in the terracotta building behind them, a long-suffering look on his face. The hetman had been calling him outside all afternoon. This time he brought the digital measure without being told. "Again with this, sirs?" he asked. Shiban waggled his fingers at the row of heads. "My dear friend, we value your impartial judgment." The aide trudged out into the sunlight and applied the measure to the heads, while Olmed stood, breathing hard, watching, his torso gleaming with sweat. The aide straightened up and turned to face the hetman, reclining side by side in the shade. "Oh, don't keep us in suspense," Sonika said. "The head is smaller by 8 microns than the head at the line end," the aide sighed, "but it is larger by 2 microns than the one behind it." Olmed punched the air and did a little victory dance. Shiban tutted. Sonika grinned. "Point dancers," he said. "Olmed, do the honors." Olmed nestled his diorite head into position at the head of the line, picked up the head Jed had brought, and threw it with all his strength out into the open field below them, where it was immediately lost again amongst millions of its kind. "Help yourself to a cup," Sonika told Olmed. He glanced at Shiban. "Sundown in, 18 minutes?" "Everything's still to play for," Shiban replied confidently. "I think," said a voice from behind them, "you have far too much time on your hands." Sonika leapt up from his canvas recliner. Hurtado Bronzy stood in the shadow of the awning, smiling at him. "Hurt, you old bastard!" Sonika cried, embracing his friend. "What the hell are you doing here?" "A matter of 20 crowns and interest growing," Bronzy replied, grinning. "This is Dimi Shiban," Sonika laughed, gesturing across at his companion, who was rising to his feet. "I know Dimi Shiban," Bronzy said, embracing the clown het and slapping his back. "Xantium, eh?" "I seem to recall you being there," said Shiban. "How you doing, you fat fugger?" Well. "Have some wine," Sonika offered. "Oh, all right," Bronzy replied. His armor was caked in dust. He yanked off his cape and his webbing and sat down. "So, this game, it has rules?" Many rules," said Shiban. "And there's money at stake?" "Money and wine," said Sonika, pouring a glass for his old friend. "2 teams," said Shiban. "Clowns and dancers, 5 men each side. They scour the fields and bring back heads. The heads go in a line by size. Retrievers win a cup of wine for each head. Incentive, you see. Sundown ends the game. Team with the largest head in the row wins." "So just get your boys to roll in one of those big buggers," Bronzy said, pointing at the boulder-sized heads resting in the sand 100 meters away. "Game over." "Ah, but this is a game of finesse," Sonika said. "Really?" Bronzy smiled, sipping from his wine cup. Shiban nodded. "If a team brings in a head that is demonstrably smaller than the largest, but larger than the next in line, the larger head gets thrown out." A very broad grin spread across Bronzy's face. "A game of finesse indeed. Who's winning?" "I am," said Sonika. Bronzy took out his purse. 4 crowns on Shiban by sundown," he said. Sonika won that day's head game in the very last minutes before dark, when Bashor Lom casually wandered in with a head that displaced the clown's latest triumph. Lon bent his back and cast the clown's usurped head back out into the field, where it had been found. Bronzy lost his 4 crowns. According to the rules of the game, Shiban bought wine for both teams. "So what are you really doing here, Hurt?" Sonika asked later on. "Let me see that hand of yours," Bronzy replied. and studied Sonika's wound as it was displayed. You'll be good. Hurtado, I asked you a question. I got a furlough, Bronzy said, sitting back in the still of the evening. The air went cold very suddenly after dark on Earth, closing in like lapping black water. They huddled in around the lamps and the peat-fired heaters. 5-day pass, signed by Uxor Honan herself. Just wanted to come check on you. That's not it, said Sonika. Why is that not it? Sonika smiled and waved to Lon to bring them a fresh bottle. Since when did Hurtado Bronzy not have a secret agenda, huh? You wound me, Petto. You wound me. Can't I come here selflessly to look up an old friend and inquire of his welfare? Sonika stared at him, a wry smile on his face, waiting for the punchline. All right, Bronzy admitted. There was something else. Excuse me, Medicae apologizes for this interruption, sir. There is a dead dancer she would like you to identify. Kazovac had brought the corpse to the cold store at the far end of the visitors' camp. The cold store was a long mud brick building throbbing with refrigeration units. Sonika and Bronzy wandered up in the chilly dark, aware of the stars draping overhead like dust on a desert shawl. The frozen, stiff bodies of Gino dead were piled up inside like firewood. Each one was wrapped in a plastic shroud. Pairs of bare, pallid feet stuck out of the ends of the stacked shrouds, decorated with toe tag labels. The Hets walked in past them, ignoring the gross stink of embalming chemicals. The corpse in question was waiting for them in the next room. Not yet preserved, it was laid out on a stainless steel gurney with drip trays slotted in to catch the noxious seep. It had been dead in the desert for several weeks, and it had bloated. The face was lost in one raw black graze, the uniform frayed and faded, the torso limp and slack where gut gas had previously bloated it. Sonika and Bronzy stood in the chilly light and shivered as they regarded it. That's no dancer I know, said Sonika. His words made smoke in the sub-zero air. Oh, but he's certainly one of yours, Het, the staff Medicae insisted. Medicae Ida was a tall woman, wearing a long surgical gown, the apron front of which was smeared with stains. She'd been a combat Uxor in her youth, but age and experience had seen her graduate to the Medicae branch as her perceptive skills dulled. Bronzy wondered if Ida missed her Uxorhood, missed her command of Gino men. It seemed so, from her tone. He's not, Sonika insisted, peering down at the corpse. Well, I don't know how you can tell that, sir, Ida said. His face is missing. He'd know, said Bronzy. Where was he found? Sonika asked, placing a hand on the corpse's wax-cold shoulder. A surgical cloth had been spread over the abdomen to obscure the ravages of the autopsy. The Tel Yutan Wadi, Medicae Ida replied. Sonika shook his head. He's not one of mine. I'm not missing anyone. The lists were in weeks ago. But he's wearing dancer insignia, Ida insisted. Here, the collar pins, and here, the brooch, she pointed. He is dressed as a dancer. Have you tissue mapped him? Sonika asked. Not yet, Ida admitted. Then you'll see the truth. This isn't one of my men. Senior Medicae Ida sighed. I know that, Het. I just wanted to confirm it before I... Before you what? Bronzy demanded. Before I alert the Chiliad Uxors. Hetman Sonika, is there any reason you can think of why one of your men would have no heart? What? No heart, Ida repeated emphatically. What the fuck did he have in there then? Bronzy asked, nodding at the corpse's covered chest. A cadmium centrifuge, replied Senior Medicae Ida gently. The subject has undergone some extreme and non-standard organ modification. His liver was, well, I've never seen anything like it. What is going on here? Asked Sonika. I don't know, Ida replied. I was hoping you might. There's something else, she added. She pulled back the surgical cloth. For a moment, all they could see was the scissor-snapped sternum and the splayed ribs caked black with blood. Here, she said, pointing. On the dead flesh of the corpse's hip, there was a small brand, partially obliterated by a shrapnel puncture. What is that? Asked Sonika, squinting at it. Is that a snake? Maybe, said Bronzy, bending down to look for himself. A snake or some kind of reptile? Sonika told the Medicae to place a guard on the corpse and send someone to wake up the post commander. He went back outside with Bronzy. Insurgent? Sonika asked. Bronzy nodded. Has to be. That mark. Sonika didn't reply. Crocodilia and other forms of aggressive reptile were the most persistently recurring of all Nerthine emblems. Have they the art to change a man inside like that? Bronzy asked. I don't know, Sonika replied, but since that night outside Tel Utan, I could believe them capable of anything. Bronzy wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Listen, Peto, the reason I came here today, it's about that night. I wanted you to know that I didn't hang you out to dry. I never thought you did hurt. Really, though, I was all for taking a force out to support you. I was warned off. I can imagine, said Sonika. Bronzy looked at him strangely. What does that mean? Sonika walked a few steps away and stared out into the great bowl of the moonlit desert. Sky and land alike, both dark, had a sheen across them, a haze produced by airborne dust. My men were used as a tactical sacrifice to break Tel Utan open. Lon and a few others know, but I've told them to stay tight-lipped. I've kept the information quiet for reasons of morale. How do you know this? Asked Bronzy. Because the men who sacrificed us told me to my face, said Sonika. And me, Bronzy replied. You saw them then, the specialists. The Alpha Legion, said Sonika. He looked at Bronzy. So many stories over the years, and then to meet them, the most secret and cunning of all the Astartes. I was this close to him, Bronzy said, as close as I am to you. He warned me off and told me why, and then told me to keep my mouth shut about the whole thing. Who? Alfarius. Sonika smiled. They were all called Alfarius, Hurt. Bronzy shook his head. This was the Primarch, Peto. I swear it. I saw his face. I believe you, said Sonika. Terror, but what kind of war are we fighting here? A war of lies and disguise and dissembling, Bronzy answered. Why else would that legion be involved? I'm not entirely sure of the significance, said Kozlov, the post commander. He was a brigadier in one of the Crimean support regiments charged with running the campaign's rear party operations. Neither are we, said Bronzy. But the fact remains that we have the body of an unidentified combatant showing signs of non-standard anatomical work and a brand mark like a reptile. We know that subversive and covert tactics are being employed in this zone, said Sonika. How do you know that? Asked Kozlov. That's classified, Bronzy said carefully. If the Nerthine have infiltrated our companies, High Command needs to know about it, Sonika went on. The body needs to be examined. so that others like it can be identified. This could break the war, man. This could be one of the key reasons those devils have us on the back foot all the time. Kozlov took a deep breath and stood up behind his camp desk. The habitant was sparsely equipped and lit only by a pair of lumen packs. Far be it from me to argue with two frontline heads, he said. What do we do? Sonika and Bronzy agreed that Honan Mu was the first point of contact. If infiltration was widespread, they had to tread carefully. They had to start with someone they knew they could trust, someone, as Bronzy pointed out, who had dealt with the specialists and therefore understood the gravity of the matter. Kozlov granted them access to the Visage's post's main Vox transmitter and personally activated the command-grade cryptogrammics using a biometric key he carried around his wrist. The channel is secure, he told them, and left the chamber. Bronzy picked up the speaker horn and threw the transmit switch. CR-23. CR-23. This is Joker Lord, broadcasting in encrypt. Stop. The Vox speaker emitted a series of dull, metallic clicks and then settled into a deep background hiss. Bronzy repeated his signal. 10 seconds passed, and then the answer came. Joker Lord, this is CR-23 reading you encrypted. Stop. The voice was cold and clear, as if the speaker was standing in the next room. Apart from a slight trebly quality caused by the cryptogrammic coding, they couldn't have asked for a stronger, purer link. CR-23, I need to speak to Uxor Mu urgently. Code Janibeg 5. Stop. Confirm code, please. Stop. The Vox answered him. The connection was so clean, the words sounded as if they were polished. Confirm code Janibeg 5. Stop. One moment, Joker Lord. Stop. Another wait. 2 minutes of liquid hiss this time. Bronzy glanced at Sonika. Joker Lord, this is Honan. Bronzy, this had better not be one of your entertainments. Stop. The tone was sharpened by the digital overlay of the cryptogrammics, but there was no mistaking Honan Mu's spiky attitude. It's not, Uxor. Trust me and listen. I've got a body here. I'm pretty convinced it's a Nurthine infiltrator, surgically altered. I think we've been compromised. Requesting your advice. Stop. A pause. Give me more information to work with, Bronzy. Stop. Uxor, I think this stiff needs to be examined by tech adepts. A full workup. We could be looking at a huge security breach. I'm thinking maybe to scare up a lifter to my position and I'll babysit the specimen up to the fleet. Stop. Stand by, Joker Lord. Stop. Bronzy lowered the speaker horn. She's wary, he said. Can you blame her, Hurt? Sonika asked. The number of pranks you've pulled over the years? They were both beginning to sweat, despite the night chill. The massive Voxcaster rig kicked out a fug of heat exhaust, and the air in the chamber was close. They waited for over 5 minutes, so long that Sonika began to pace. Then the Vox cycled up again. Joker Lord, this is CR-23. Respond. Stop. Bronzy picked up the horn and waited until all 5 green lights on the console had relit, indicating full-strength cryptogrammics. CR-23, this is Joker Lord. Stop. What is your position, Bronzy? Stop. CR-345, Uxor. Stop. Listen to me, Bronzy. I can't risk an air extraction from where you are. There are some details I can't go into, even via encrypt. Suggest you get transport and move fast and light. I'm checking the charts now. Yes, leave Telcat and head west along the Sarmak Trail. If you don't mess around, you should be able to get to CR-8291 by dawn. I'll divert a cavalry squadron to pick you up there and escort you in. Did you get all that? Stop. Bronzy nodded, even though she couldn't see him. Understood, Axel. Stop. Is this workable, Bronzy? Stop. Absolutely. Stop, Bronzy replied. The link leaked out an ambient hiss for a moment. CR23? Bronzy, I need you to tell me who knows about this. Stop. Say again. Stop. Who knows the details of this incident, Het? Stop. Bronzy frowned. Me? The post commander, the duty medicae, maybe a couple of staffers. Stop. Understood. Thank you. I'm sorry, Bronzy, but we need to keep this close for now. Are you ready to move? Stop. Yes, Axel. Joker Lord, out. The lights went out, and the hissing died away. Bronzy threw the Voxcaster's power down switches and got up. All right, then, he said. Why didn't you mention me? Sonika asked. What? When she asked who knew, why didn't you mention my name? Because you're staying here, Bronzy told him. Bronzy had a few words with Kozlov, and a pair of Crimean non-combatants were sent to bring a transport up from the hard standing behind the main dwelling cluster of visages. Then Bronzy strode off to the billet he'd been given. Sonika followed him. What do you mean I'm staying here? Sonika asked, as Bronzy quickly repacked his haversack. Don't start. Bronzy? There was a warning tone in Sonika's inflection. Bronzy stopped what he was doing and looked around at his old friend. Was it just me? Or did Moo sound seriously weird? She was just being wary. I said that. Bronzy shook his head. Something's up. I need you to be my joker, Peto. What? My ace in the hole. If anything goes wrong, you'll still know what I know. That's why you're staying here. Nothing's going to go wrong, said Sonika. Bronzy laughed. How many years have we been soldiers, Pedo? Enough to know that covering your arse is never a waste of time, Sonika replied. He shook his head. We're worrying about nothing. No, said Bronzy. We've found ourselves in a war of lies, disguise, and dissembling. We're worrying about everything. Sonika didn't look convinced. Come on, Bronzy rumbled. That's why the Geno 5-2 has survived this long. We fight smart. We always have. Brains have got us out of more scrapes than balls. In your case, I'd hardly trust either. Bronzy winked. He wasn't going to rise to the bait. He lashed up his haversack and swung it onto his shoulder. Don't go alone, Sonika said. I won't. I'll take Dimi Shiban with me. I can trust him, and he knows how to handle himself if there's an outbreak of stupid. Good. All right. Let's be off then, said Bronzy. The transport Kozlov provided was a scarab pattern carrier, a medium-sized armoured speeder with a troop hold for stowage and a stern-mounted auto turret. Its long, gently curved hull had been sprayed in a desert tan, but as it slid towards them out of the night on its powerful suspension fields, it looked like a desert phantom, cold and moonlight blue. The delivery crew dismounted, leaving the engines running. Medicae Ida loaded the wrapped body into the hold and made it secure. I can provide a driver, Kozlov offered. No need, Bronzy replied, tossing his haversack in through the open hold hatch. I can handle one of these babies. You're infantry, Kozlov said. I'm a Renaissance man, Bronzy replied. There are few things in this galaxy I can't turn my hand to. And entirely mess up, Sonika said. Shiban ran up to join them out of the cold darkness. He was lugging a pack and a twin-barreled Las carbine. What's this about? He asked. I'll tell you once we're moving, Bronzy said. All secure, Doc? Medicae Ida jumped down from the hold and sealed the hatch behind her. I've secured it in ice blocks, but it will deteriorate. Get it into stasis as quickly as you can. The organs? Individually packed in vacuum-sealed bags in the hopper under the gurney. Thanks, Doc, Bronzy smiled. Shiban was already climbing aboard through the cabin hatch. Bronzy looked back at Sonika. I hate goodbyes, he said. So, fug off. Sonika laughed. Bronzy turned away and then swung back round to face Sonika. His face was solemn. Look, Peto, there is one thing. One thing I just want to say. What is it, Hurt? Bronzy looked him in the eyes, all seriousness. Peto, have you got that money you owe me? The speeder kicked up dust like a gauzy bridal train and slipped away into the cold desert night. Kozlov, Ida, and the non-combatants turned away and walked back into the post. Sonika stood out in the chilly darkness under the enveloping cloak of the sky and watched until all traces of the speeder had vanished into the endless black. They ran the Scarab into the west, along the old trail, using only Auspex and the low-light viewers wired to the dashboard. The viewers showed the world like a green moonscape, but they had only a 110-degree forward spread, so when Bronzy or Shiban turned their heads too far left or right, the ghostly view vanished in a wash of fizzle and telemetry junk. The Scarab coasted well and made 80 kilometers per hour over the clearest terrain. Bronzy loved grav-effect transports and always tried to secure them for his jokers when dismount assaults were on the cards. He let Shiban drive for the first 3 hours through the tipping point of midnight. The stars came out over the desert rim with a rare magnificence heightened by their viewers. You ever going to tell me what this is about? Shiban asked. No, said Bronzy. 3 hours before sunrise, Bronzy took the stick. The world ahead of him was a jumbled, fast-moving path of line-cast furrows with the occasional emerald crag looming for a moment before it was lost behind them. Shiban sat back, reclining in the shotgun seat, and took a pinch from his box. Then he played with the auto-turret controls, impelling the SenseNet to target the stern guns at passing rocks and crumbling slopes of sand rock. Set it on auto, sir, and get some kip, Dimmy, Bronzy suggested. Shiban yawned and promptly fell asleep, rocking in his leather cradle. Bronzy envied him. It had been years since he'd been able to manage the old Geno trick of crash sleep, the hypnosuggestive shutdown that allowed a man to catch a wink under any circumstances. Bronzy had been trained that way, but the knack had left him. He kept his hand closed around the bucking stick and watched the ghost-green world outside flash by. The sun came up, a slow, terrible firestorm rising from the south. All of the landscape's shadows stretched out, long and painful, and Bronzy took off the viewer. White light filtered in through the cabin's chipped and crazed windows, and he decided to rely on Auspex alone. 20 kilometers now. The cursor on the cab's light map display moved slowly towards its destination. Sonika woke with a start. Nothing special there. The dull afterglow of pain in his hand had woken him that way every morning since he'd arrived at Visages. He sat up on his bunk. Dawn light, already hot and bright, speared in through the gaps around his rattan blind. He'd been having the strangest dream. He'd been playing the head game with Dimmy, and Lon had brought him a good piece. He'd taken the diorite head out of Lon's calloused hands and looked down at it to judge it. The carved face had been Hurtado's. It had grinned up at him. Tell me this, Peto, the head had said. All these broken heads, are any two faces alike? or are they all different? I don't know, Hurt. Get out of my dream. It's important. Do they all look the same? Are they all different? Doesn't that matter? Doesn't it? Sonika had lobbed the head away into the wide scree field of broken heads. He'd done it with his left hand. His left hand had had fingers and a thumb. Fug, Sonika said, coughing. He had dust in his throat. That was par for the course at Visages. He looked down at his incomplete hand and felt the missing fingers waggle. He had slept naked. He pulled on his breeches, socks, and boots and went out into the early light, bare-chested. A hard rind of sun was cresting the edge of the crags. The sky was off-white, like old ivory, and the landscape was a pink wash, broken by hard black shadows bending to evade the sun. It was going to be a hot one. He could already feel the air baking. The local livestock, some of them still saddled from the previous day's racing, wandered free, grazing the patchy grasses. Sonika walked towards the well, rubbing his face with his good hand. He needed a shave and a grapefruit. The livestock all looked up at the same time. They stared in the same direction, some of them still chewing, and then broke and scattered. Geno instinct pulled Sonika back into the cold shadows of one of the terracotta huts. He looked around, suddenly very alert. Where were the sentries? The perimeter guard? The overnight patrols? The pink wash of the landscape moved. Semi-visible figures scurried forwards out of the desert rim. Sonika swallowed hard. He turned and ran back through the shaded maze of dwellings towards the post commander's habitant. He wanted to raise the alarm, but he didn't want the enemy to know he'd raised the alarm. Kozlov had a silent signal device that trembled every post resident's wrist cuff. Sonika slipped into the hot darkness of the habitant. Kozlov sat at his camp desk, staring at Sonika in surprise. "Commander," Sonika whispered, "emergency alert, now!" Kozlov didn't move. He continued to stare back at Sonika with the same look of mild surprise. "Commander Kozlov!" Kozlov's eyes did not follow Sonika as he moved forwards. They continued to stare at the tent flap where Sonika had entered. Kozlov didn't move at all. Sonika threw himself sideways. The falx swung by the Ekvernuth, concealed behind the inner tent flap, missed the hetman by a matter of centimeters. The blade chopped through the ground sheet into the dirt beneath. Sonika rolled and came up on his feet. The Nerthine yanked his long blade free and charged him. "Alarm! Alarm!" Sonika began to shout. "Enemy in the camp!" He dived headlong over the desk to avoid the lunging blade and fell into Kozlov. Kozlov toppled backwards off his seat, his camp table collapsing under Sonika's weight. Blood ebbed slackly out of Kozlov's nose and mouth. He continued to stare in mild surprise at the roof of the tent. Sonika rolled off the still warm corpse and fumbled frantically to release Kozlov's service pistol from its holster. The Nerthine whirled his falx so high it ripped a slit in the tent roof. He swung it down. Sonika threw himself to one side. The descending blade cut clean through Kozlov's left shoulder. "Alarm!" Sonika yelled again, diving away. Outside, he heard shouting and the sudden sporadic bark of las weapons. Sonika threw a saddlebag at the advancing Nerthine, and the whispering falx struck it aside. He scrambled backwards, hurling a writing case. The falx splintered it, and a shower of pens, nibs, and blotting patches spilled out. Sonika ducked again, and the falx tore a wide gash in the tent wall. Geno training took over. As he landed, Sonika groped for a weapon, any weapon, and found a writing quill that had fallen out of the writing case. Sonika seized it, tested its weight automatically, and threw it like a dart, underhand. It embedded itself, nib first, in the Ekvernuth's left cheek. The Nerthine yelped and lurched backwards. Sonika leapt up and grabbed the haft of the falx. He kneed the Nerthine in the groin. Now the bastard really staggered. He howled. His grip on the falx weakened. Sonika tore the weapon out of the Ekvanerth's hands and swung it. The Ekvanerth's head rolled clean off his shoulders in a puff of blood. The body folded up, and the head bounced off the ground sheet beside it. Gripping the falx, Sonika strode across the habitent to the master alarm control. He smacked it, and sirens began to wail all across the Visage's post. He walked back to Kozlov's body, staked the falx blade down in the ground, and pulled out the service pistol, a heavy las model. Two Nerthine raiders burst in through the habitant mouth, and Sonika shot them both in the face. They walloped over on their backs, their silver plates dotted with droplets of blood. Pandemonium had erupted outside the command tent. The waking Imperial troops, roused by his shots and the blaring sirens, were scrambling to fight off the Nerthine intruders. The dawn air whizzed with gunfire and the swuck of impacting blades. Sonika heard awful wails of pain. With the pistol in his good hand, he went outside into the baking air. A Nerthine ran at him, falx raised. Sonika blew the man's throat out with a single shot and dropped him on the sand. All around him, las carbines rattled on auto. The shouts and yells were deafening. He ran towards the cold store. Bodies littered the ground outside the mud brick building. Imperial soldiers, mostly half-dressed, sliced into pieces. He went inside and shot down the two Nerthine he found there. One fell forwards against the stacked, frozen bodies in their shrouds and wrenched off his breastplate as he slid down. The breastplate landed in front of Sonika, rattling to a stop. He saw the engraved reed emblems and the snapping crocodilia. "Get out!" a voice gasped. "Run!" He turned. Medicae Ida stood behind him. She clutched at the falx that stapled her through the chest to the cold store wall. Her gown was soaked in blood. Her own for the first time. "Medicae!" Sonika yelled. "Too late for me!" She wheezed and died. A Nerthine raider burst in behind them, and Sonika spun around, firing a shot that silenced the man forever. More followed, falxes raised. Sonika began to shoot. By his weapon's digital display, he had 20 shots left. 19, 18, 17. Bronzy brought the scarab to rest and hit the dampers. The sun was up, fierce and bold. "Wake up," he told Shiban as he unstrapped his harness. Shiban groaned. Bronzy jumped down out of the speeder and looked around. His stomach was grumbling. Where the hell was Honan's promised cavalry? The cratered desert spread out all around him in the burning light of the rising sun. He saw a figure toiling up the trail towards him. A tall figure, wobbled by the heat haze. Bronzy waited. 2 minutes, 3. The figure came closer, becoming properly visible. It was a space marine, in full battle plate. The armor was purple, trimmed in silver, with green markings on the immense shoulder plates. "Great God," Bronzy murmured. The towering Astartes came to a halt 10 paces from Bronzy and the speeder. Soft red light glowed like embers in its eye slits as it read and targeted him. "Bronzy, we meet again," the helmet speaker crackled. "Sir?" The Astartes held its massive bolt gun close against its armored chest. "I warned you. You really do know how to stir up trouble, don't you, Hurtado?" Bronzy blinked. "I don't understand. This is important. This is none of your business. But you've made it your business, which is a colossal mistake and a shame because you're a decent fellow. There's only one option." "What the fuck are you talking about?" Bronzy cried, wishing very suddenly he'd brought a weapon with him. Back right off, you son of a bitch, Shiban declared, moving out from behind the cover of the hovering tank, his double carbine raised to his shoulder and aimed squarely at the armored figure. Jimmy, don't, Bronzy yelled. No one threatens my friends, Shiban growled back. He edged forwards, his weapon fixed steadily on the figure in purple armor. The Astartes turned its visor slowly to regard Shiban. The soft red ember light flickered in its eye slits. Far too fast for Bronzy to follow, the Astartes wheeled and fired its bolter. Dimitar Shiban, who remembered his dreams word for word, left the ground and exploded as he traveled backwards, showering blood and meat in all directions. His twisted carcass hit the ground and lay still. Oh, God! Oh, terror! No! Bronzy yelled. The Astartes switched its aim back to Bronzy. Bronzy sank to his knees in the dust. Please, he murmured. As I said, the Space Marine remarked, stepping forwards, its bolter aimed. There is only one option. Why are you doing this? Bronzy pleaded. For the Emperor, the Astartes replied. Chapter 3. Monlo Harbour, Nurth, 2 days later. Though John Grammaticus was over 1,000 years old, he had only been Konig Henniker for 8 months, and he was still getting used to the idea. According to his file, and as far as any imperial methods of scrutiny were concerned, Konig Henniker was a 52-year-old man from a region of Terra known as the Caucasus, and he served in the Imperial Army as an intelligence officer attached to the Geno 52 Chiliad. Grammaticus still thought of himself as essentially human. He had been born human, raised as a human, and he had been human when, to all intents and purposes, he had died for the first time. Definitions became a little more complicated after that. One thing was certain: at some non-specific point after his first death, probably as the result of a slow process rather than a sudden change of heart, he had stopped being quite so steadfast in his devotion to the interests of his birth species. He was still unashamedly fond of the human race and was a stout apologist for its less edifying qualities, but he had been with the Cabal for a long time, and they had shared the acuity with him, at least in part. These days he saw what his birth race had once been wont to call the long view. Grammaticus was one of the last few humans still working as an agent of the Cabal. Over the centuries, the Cabal had recruited a good many human go-betweens, but most of them were long dead, forgotten, or disavowed. The Cabal had been recruiting human agents for as long as there had been humans to recruit, a fact Grammaticus always found particularly hard to reconcile. At the very start of human history, before writing, before and Cattle Hayek, before Mohenjo-Daro and Thebes, before the construction of the Lost Monuments, the Cabal had visited Terra and encountered a breed of unprepossessing, unpromising mammalian hominids busy making its first axe marks on the trunks of ancient woodland trees to mark out its first boundaries. The Cabal had seen some particular quality in those mammalian hominids. They had recognized that the hominids would one day rise inexorably to play a pivotal role in the scheme of all things. Mankind would become the greatest weapon against the primordial annihilator, or it would become the primordial annihilator's greatest weapon. Either way, the Cabal decided that the unprepossessing mammalian hominids developing on that backwater world were not a species to be dismissed. Grammaticus knew that this fact frustrated most of the Cabal's inner circle. They were old kinds, every damn one of them, and regarded all the upstart species of the galaxy as inferior ephemera. It pained them to accept that their destiny, all Destinies lay in the purview of creatures that had been simple single-cell protocytes when the old kind cultures were already mature. Garhet had once told Grammaticus that the Cabal had made its first subtle advances towards the human species long before the advent of the Age of Terror. Garhet had said this bitterly, and more bitterly still had admitted the Cabal's repeated failure to apply influence on human development. "You've always been feral, stubborn brutes," Garhet had said, "shockingly dogmatic in your self-worth. We tried to direct you and influence your course. It was like..." Garhet had paused, allowing his mind to select an appropriately humanocentric simile. "It was like commanding a tide to turn back," he finished. Grammaticus had smiled. "We are a headstrong people, aren't we?" he had replied, with no little pride. "Did you not think it might have been easier to cull us before we grew teeth?" Garhet had nodded, or at least he had flexed his secondary nostrils in a mannerism that equated to a nod. "That was not our way, then. We all deem such notions as gross barbarism. All of us except Slough Dar, of course." "Of course. And now?" "Now I regret we did not abort you when we had the chance. Destruction has become our only tool in latter days. I miss the subtle methods." Almost all of the humans recruited down the years had proved to be unviable or flawed. Most had been disposed of. Grammaticus believed that he had succeeded where so many others had failed because of his gift. John Grammaticus was a high-function psyker. "The Uxor will see you, Head Henniker," the subaltern in the fur shako announced. "Thank you," John Grammaticus replied, and got up off the wooden chair at the end of the corridor. He walked down the hall towards the briefing room door, straightening his double-breasted jacket and cape. He undid the collar buttons of his shirt. It was almost noon, and the Terracotta Palace was sweltering. Situated 15 kilometers outside Monlo Harbour, the palace had been commandeered as a control station for the advance. Its ancient walls held the day's heat like an oven. Reed screens soaked in water had been fixed over the windows to keep the palace interiors cool and fresh, but they were beginning to dry out. John Grammaticus had no physiological need to perspire, but he permitted his body to do so. Every other human around was sweating freely, and he didn't want them to notice that he wasn't like them. He knocked at the door. "Come." He went in. The chamber was long and broad, with pillars flanking the walls to support the tiled ceiling. The tops of the pillars had been carved to resemble the fronds of reeds or snapping crocodilia, both common features in Nerthine architecture. A folding steel table had been set up in the center of the room, and Uxor Ruxana stood at the head of it. Her 4 aides ranged on either side of the table beside her. "Uxor," Grammaticus said, "good to see you." He tapped his throat. "I apologize for the unbuttoning, but this objectionable heat..." "Quite all right, Konig," she replied. Her aides all nodded accordingly. They were all female, all aged between 13 and 16, Uxors in waiting. Their ovaries had already been harvested for the Geno 5-2 Chiliad stock banks. They were now honing their sept powers and acting as a support buffer for their assigned Uxor. Grammaticus found the operational structure of the Geno 5-2 Chiliad quite fascinating. Formed during the savage continental wars that had engulfed Terra at the end of the Age of Strife, the Geno had proved to be a most effective and adaptable force. No wonder the Emperor had permitted them to endure after unification. No wonder he had looked upon their system and stolen from it. The Geno practiced genic mustering. Grammaticus had been thoroughly briefed on this. Genic mastering had been an essential tool during those caustic years of atomic hurricanes and drifting rad clouds. The core of the regiment was the Uxors, a bloodline of latent, psychically sensitive females. The females had their eggs harvested at puberty, and from them the heavy-built uterine soldiery of the unit were vat-grown, using the genetic codes of several proven, robust, agnate gene pools, notorious for their martial merit. The Geno grew tough warriors, but they complemented their brute strength and kept the pool clean by importing smart, proven field commanders from other forces. The Hetmen were always non-stock individuals who excelled at tactics and strategy. The Uxors at the top of the Chiliad's command tree were no longer capable of carrying children of their own to term. This, in ways not entirely understood, freed their minds and allowed them to operate as perceptives, operational coordinators who could appreciate, as Garhet had put it during the briefing, the behavior of their children. At best, the Uxors were weak psychers. Each one was capable of a rudimentary talent known as the Sept, enough to enable their forces in the field and supply them with some insight. They burned out quickly. By 26, 27, they were done as Uxors and restricted to other duties. During their active phase as perceptives, they were always accompanied by aides, Uxors in training, whose raw psychic talent bolstered the perceptive power of their Uxor even as they learned from her. None of the females in the chamber possessed a fraction of John Grammaticus's talent. As he sat down at the end of the table, opposite Uxor Roxana, he reached out. Instantly, he tasted feeble, immature septs, chitter-chatter minds, the moist, unwholesome mental architecture of the pubescent aides. The technical inability to conceive made most Uxor aides gruesomely promiscuous. Grammaticus was repelled by the lurid, shallow thoughts that washed towards him. The aides were all thinking about the next soldier boy they'd hump, or how fabulous it was going to be to become an Uxor. Roxana was different. Grammaticus looked down the table towards her. For a start, she was a woman, not a girl. A startlingly appealing woman. Her lips were full, her long, straight, blonde hair center-parted, her eyes heavily lashed and exotically grey. A master sculptor could not have improved upon her cheekbones. She was also 28, and at the end of her Uxor service. He could feel that she hated this fact. She was broken by the thought that she would soon be something else, a Medicae, a Munitorum commander, a cartomancer, an Uxor emeritus. Her powers were ebbing. Her sept was waning and weakening. "What do you have for me, sir?" she asked. Quite a voice. Even the aides took notice. Husky. No, silky, like honey. Grammaticus knew he was a little in love with her, and allowed himself to relish the fact. It had been a long time, 700 years, give or take, since he had permitted himself to respond to a human female in any way other than physical need. "Well, I have plenty, Uxor," he replied, taking out the document case from under his arm and opening it. "You've actually been in Monlo Harbour?" asked one of the aides, looking right at him. Grammaticus felt a wash of admiring lust. "Yes? What's your name?" "Tuvi, sir," the girl said. She was the most mature of Roxana's aides, about 19. Tuvi clearly found the idea of a daring intelligence officer quite intoxicating. "Yes, Tuvi. I made cover as a merchant called Dasal Hulta, and spent the last 4 days gathering evidence in the inner quarters of the town." Amongst other things, he thought. "Wasn't that terribly dangerous?" asked another of the aides. "Yes, it was. said Grammaticus. How were you not unmasked by the infidel enemy? Asked Tuvi. Be quiet, Roxana told her girls. Intelligence operatives are hardly required to give away the tricks. It's all right, Axor, Grammaticus smiled. He looked at Tuvi and said, El te tanash el et she tane. What? Tuvi replied. It means, Grammaticus told her, I speak the local language as a native does, in Nerthine. But, Tuvi began, my dear, I'm not going to tell you how, so please don't ask. If I might continue? Tuvi looked as if he was going to say something else. Let the man speak, Tuvi, Roxana snapped. Henneke? Oh, of course. Well, the location itself, as we know, the Nerthine have no orbital or interplanetary technology, nor have ever possessed such means. However, the area known as Mon Lo Harbor, though flooded and used for maritime shipping, was originally constructed as a setting down point for starships. Uxor Roxana blinked. For starships? She echoed. He was taking a slight risk in sharing this information, but John Grammaticus's mind was finely trained to sort and appraise data. He knew exactly what he could give up and what he couldn't. He believed it mattered very little if the Imperials found out that Mon Lo had once been an extraplanetary setdown. It was a halting site, in fact. The Cabal used to visit here long ago. That's why they knew about the Nerthine culture. For starships, Uxor. Are you sure? Uxor Roxana asked. Absolutely, Grammaticus replied. I have excellent sources. And when you say originally, Konig, what does originally mean? It means something between 8 and 12,000 years ago. Enough time for sea levels to change, for floodplains to rise, and for a massive stone-cut extraplanetary harbor to fill with water and become a harbor of a more traditional nature. It was 11,826 years, in fact, and the construction work had taken 18 months. Grammaticus felt it wise to fudge the precision of his knowledge. The aides started speaking all at once. That would place construction during the second age of technology, said one. Around the time of the first contact event and the first alien wars, said another. Is there any evidence as to which xenoform might have been responsible? Asked another. Do the Nerthine know of its provenance? Asked Tuvi. Tuvi frames the best question, said Grammaticus, shutting down the chatter. Do they know? Well, I don't believe they do. They possess myths and legends, as all cultures do, and some of them contain elements that might be interpreted as containing some race memory of xeno contact or intervention. But until the 670th expedition came along, the Nerthine believed they were alone in the galaxy. Remember, the Nerthine don't even realize they were originally colonists from Terra. That is the true misery of this war, Roxana nodded. They do not recognize us as kin. Grammaticus felt her discomfort. Kinship meant so much to the Geno Uxors. Indeed, he found this aspect of the Emperor's Great Crusade especially troubling. In its youth, mankind had spilled out across the stars, colonizing thousands of worlds, forming the first human stellar community. Then the age of strife had come down, like the blade of a guillotine, and for the better part of 5,000 years, warp storms had rendered interstellar travel impossible. The outreaches of man had become cut off, beleaguered, isolated. In that turmoil, many offshoots had entirely forgotten who they were or where they had come from. Such was the case with Nerth. When the Emperor, a figure long foreseen by the Cabal, had finally unified the anarchic fragments of Terra, he had undertaken a great crusade. Oh, how telling was that title! To seek out and reconnect with the lost outposts of the human race, It was astonishing how often the lost worlds resisted those overtures of reconnection. It was unconscionable how many times the roving expedition fleets had been forced to go to war with the very cultures they had set out to rescue and embrace, just to bring them to what the Emperor had euphemistically called compliance. It was always, so the official line went, for their own good. John Grammaticus had met the Emperor once, close on 1,000 years before. The Emperor had been just another feudal warlord then, leading his thunder-armored troops in an effort to consolidate his early Strife Age victories and pave the way to eventual unification. Grammaticus had been a line officer in the Caucasian levies, a significant force inveigled by truce and pact to support the Emperor's assault on the territorial holdings of the Pan-Pacific tyrant Duma. After a bloody conquest at Bactria, Grammaticus had been one of 100 Caucasian officers invited to a triumph at Pash, hosted by the retinues of the Thunderbolt and Lightning army. During the festivities, the Emperor, even then he had been known only by that objectionable epithet, had grandly toured the tables to personally thank his foreign allies and the leaders of the mercenary clans. Grammaticus had been one of hundreds present to receive his grateful handshake. In that moment of contact, he had seen why the Emperor was a force to be reckoned with. A psyche of towering, unimaginable strength, not really human at all by any contemporary measure of the fact. Grammaticus, who had never met anyone else like himself, had shuddered and felt like a drone insect in the presence of its hive king. The Emperor had felt Grammaticus in the same passing second of contact. He had smiled. "You have a fine mind, John," he had said, without having to ask Grammaticus his name. "We should talk and consider the options available to beings like us." Before any such conversation could happen, Grammaticus had died, that painful, stupid first death. Looking back, Grammaticus wondered if he would ever have been able to influence the Emperor's course if he'd lived. He doubted it. Even then, in that tiny moment of connection, it had been clear that the Emperor was never going to turn away from the road of catastrophic bloodshed he was set upon. One day, he would unleash upon the galaxy the most dreadful killing machines of all, the Astartes. How ironic it was that Grammaticus's current task was to broker cooperation with one of those fearsome Astartes legions. Garhet had once remarked to Grammaticus that the Emperor was the only human who would ever have made a viable addition to the Cabal's inner circle. "He sees the long picture of it," Garhet had said. "He understands the vast, slow cycle and is content to allow it to run its course. He appreciates the epochal dynamic of true and thorough change." "Have you ever met him?" Grammaticus had asked. "No, John, I haven't." "Then you have no idea what a bloodthirsty bastard he really is." Garhet smiled. "That's as maybe, but he understands that the primordial annihilator is the true enemy of everything. So perhaps we need a bloodthirsty bastard on our side." "Konig." "I'm sorry, Uxor," Grammaticus said. Roxana smiled down the table at him. "You were quite lost in thought." "I was. I apologize. Where was I? It is my belief that the extraplanetary harbor was built by some Xenos kind several hundred years before this world was colonized by the original human outships. As far as the Nerthine are concerned, it has always been here." "So it is an intriguing aside and not pertinent to our combat evaluation?" "Indeed not. But for all their parochial mindset, the Nerthine have an appreciation of extraplanetary matters. They have lived in fear of first contact, of discovery by beings from other worlds. In their doctrine, our arrival proves to them the universal presence of evil. There is no dealing with them. None at all? No, Aksur. He wanted to tell her that they were dealing with a human culture that had succumbed to the corruption of the primordial annihilator. But he knew she simply wouldn't understand what chaos meant. Very few humans did. Grammaticus did, because he had shared the Cabal's acuity. He had a feeling, deep in his gut, that the Emperor knew all too well. So why hadn't he told any of his children? Why hadn't he forewarned them about the deathless abomination they would encounter if they ventured out into the stars? The briefing turned to matters of fortification and placement. Grammaticus had brought the plans he had carefully hand-drawn. Discussion began on the best practice of attack on Monlo. Tuvi surprised him by suggesting the most perceptive tactical solutions. She would be a full Uxor soon, with a pack of aides of her own. Roxana let her lead the plotting, nodding contentedly at her stepdaughter's excellence. As the talk went to and fro, Grammaticus decided, willfully, it was time to switch places. He put himself behind Roxana's eyes. She was far too preoccupied to resist or even notice, and looked back down the table at himself. He saw what she saw. A well-made man of mature years, strong in the back and arms, with a very handsome face and grey hair. The man wore a scarlet dress coat with ornate double frogging down the front, and he was perspiring very slightly. Not bad, thought John Grammaticus. Not bad at all. It wasn't the body he'd been born with, but at least it pretended to be from the Caucasus, which was where the first John Grammaticus had been born, towards the end of the 29th millennium. If we are going to commit to an attack, Tuvi was saying, we need to know more about the enemy disposition in these lines, and along the north wall here, and here. I wasn't able to collect data, Grammaticus replied, but you're right, I'll be going in again tomorrow. In 3 days I should have the information you need. Good, said Roxana. She paused. You're going inside again? I think it's necessary, Aksur. Then may the Emperor protect you, Tuvi said, and several of the aides echoed her. Oh, I'm quite sure he won't, Grammaticus thought. That's all for today, Roxana told her aides. Be off with you. I'll finish the brief myself. Grammaticus sensed annoyance and disappointment as the aides filed out. The door closed behind them. There was a long silence. Where were we? Uxor Roxana asked. You were about to undress, he said, in demotic Scythian. Was I indeed? She laughed, answering in the same language. I had no idea you were fluent in my native tongue, or knew me to be of Scythian extraction. You're very clever, Konig. You don't know the half of it, he thought. I'm fluent instantly in every tongue, every language I encounter. It's my particular talent and my curse. I'm sorry to be forward, he said, again in Scythian, but I've seen the way you look at me. And I've seen the way you look at me, sir. Is it so bad? Roxana smiled. No, Konig, it's flattering. But I'm no aide Carter Hussey. I'm not about to disrobe for some sordid little tryst in this briefing room. I'm not sure I'm going to disrobe for you at all. Grammaticus allowed a smile to cross Henniker's face. My dear Uxor, he said, the simple doubt expressed in that sentence is all I could ever ask for. In the old times, in the time of inchoation, races built their fastnesses in places of safety and left the darker places unexplored. It had been the primitive instinct of man to behave this way. It had kept him safe from the wolf and the saber cat. Grammaticus wished his species had kept hold of this instinct and not forsaken it. The darker places were darker places for a reason. He was fairly certain it was the eternal influence of the emperor that had quashed that particular taboo. He thought of Terra's old maps, with their quaintly phrased notations of warning, "Here be dragons." That had always been a shorthand motto of man's ignorance of the darker places of his universe. "What did you say?" Roxana asked, rolling over sleepily. "Nothing," he replied. "You said something about dragons, Konig." "I may have." "There are no dragons, Konig." It was late afternoon. The palace compound had sweltered out another day, so close to the sea everyone could smell it, yet so far away its cooling influence did not reach. The sex had been exceptional. The emotional intimacy had almost reduced him to tears. He hated allowing himself to get so close. 700 years was a long time, long enough for him to forget the consequences of proper connection. He had felt her hunger, her appetite to prove she was still something of significance, even though her Uxorhood was sloughing away like dead skin. He had allowed himself to love her, and allowed her to reciprocate. And now he faced up to the consequences of that decision. Konig? She didn't even know his real name. He wanted to tell her. "Do you have to go back in?" she asked, rolling over and lying sidelong. Her lithe, naked body made him stir, but he resisted the temptation. "Yes." "I'm sure we can do the rest of the tactical plan with drone spotters and the fleet appraisal." "You can't. You need me in there." "John?" "Oh, no." "Oh, no, what?" she asked, sitting up. He rose to his feet. "Nothing, my love." "My love, that sounds very serious." "John, not now." "You've gone quite pale, Con. Are you all right?" He paced away from the bed, barefoot, towards the washroom. "I'm fine, absolutely fine. I just need a sip of water." Roxana rolled onto her back and stared at the ceiling. "Don't be long," she called. Grammaticus entered the washroom, closed the door behind him, and paused for a moment, head down, leaning his hands on the edges of the stone basin. "Not now, really, not now," he moaned softly. The stone was cool under his palms. He poured some water into it from the jug. All the while he could feel the old chipped mirror hanging on the wall behind him. He turned around. Garhet looked out at him from the mirror's cloudy surface. "You have taken a wrong step, John Grammaticus. The intimate bond you have made with this female is impairing your mission. Go away. John, you are risking everything. You know what's at stake. What are you doing?" "Being human for a change," Grammaticus replied. "John, we have eliminated agents for less." "I'm sure you have. Not in the old days, but in these latter days. I'm sure you have." "I am not threatening you, John." "Yes, you actually are," he told the mirror. "The galaxy must live." Right. And can I be allowed to live in it a little?" Garhet's face faded slowly. Grammaticus rinsed his face in cold water from the stone basin. "Bastards," he spat. Before dawn, in a cool mauve twilight, the escort arrived to take Grammaticus back to the insertion point. He had already been up for an hour, ritually packing and repacking his small bag. He told the escort to wait with the vehicle and finished his chores, sipping tepid black caffeine and eating some preserved fruits and spelt bread left over from the night before. She surprised him by waking up. "Were you planning on leaving without a goodbye?" "No," he lied. "Good." Roxana brushed a strand of long blonde hair off her face and looked him up and down. He had dressed in a simple desert suit of soft brown kidskin with army-issue boots and a canvas jacket. "You don't look much like a native." "That part comes later." All she was wearing was the sheet from the bed. "Well, goodbye then. The Emperor protects." "Let's hope so," he agreed. "Try to come back," Roxana said. "I'd like to see you again." "I'll come back," he replied, not lying this time, "because I want to see you again." Uxor Roxana smiled and tilted her head slightly to one side, regarding him. "There's something about you, Konig. It's as if you see right into me." "That's because I do," he said. The escort, a young Geno Company Bashor, and 3 sleepy troopers were waiting for him in the rear yard of the palace compound. The ride was a light speeder, the hull of which had been sand-blasted back to bare metal by the environment. "Sir," the Bashor saluted as Grammaticus walked out of the lit doorway into the darkness of the yard with his bag over his shoulder. It took a second to place the man's background accent. Indonesia, Purwakarta Administrative District, perhaps one of the Cianjur hives. "What's your unit?" Grammaticus asked in Bahasa Malay. The Bashor blinked in surprise and smiled. "Arakli, sir," he replied. "I didn't know you were a Panpak, sir." "I'm not. I'm from all over." They got in and rode out of the yard and through the descending levels of the ancient desert palace, via checkpoints, gateways, and night-watch barricades, where sentries lurked beside sputtering braziers, their rifles hooked through their folded arms. Papers and biometrics were routinely checked. The Nerthine had a subversive streak. Experience had taught the Imperial Army that the Nerthine had spies of their own. Saboteurs, too. It felt odd to be a spy checked on the way out. Outside the palace perimeter, the speeder picked up velocity and coasted along the bombed-out avenues and dust-dressed streets of the township surrounding the compound. The sun was threatening to rise behind the passing ruins. Grammaticus sat back in the rear seat, trying to relax, trying to compose his focus into identity immersion, feeling the breeze of motion against his face. He began to regret making a connection with the young Bashor. The officer sitting up front kept leaning around and talking to Grammaticus about places in Cianjur that Grammaticus had never visited, nor had any wish to visit. Grammaticus had been in Cianjur once, long ago. He'd been there as part of an army that had burned the place down 500 years before the hive the Bashor had grown up in had even been planned. He closed his eyes and thought of Roxana. "It's as if you see right into me." There was too much truth in that. His mind saw into everything. It made him think of the thing he tried never to think about. That day, long ago, meeting the Emperor, shaking his hand, tasting the power, and seeing behind the glamour of that handsome, noble, healthy face, seeing, just for a nanosecond, seeing. "Are you quite well, sir?" the Bashor asked. "You went rather pale all of a sudden. Is it motion sickness?" "No, I'm fine. Absolutely fine," Grammaticus replied. They came up out of the ruins and followed the rutted dispersal tracks around the back of the dug-in Imperial lines. The sun was rising, crisping the lower edge of the sky. In the lee of the earthworks, for kilometre after kilometre, gun emplacements made sulking silhouettes against the dawn. and millions of bivouac tents covered the ground like blisters, breakfast fires glowing. They passed standards and banners hanging limp in the slowly heating air. "That's my lot," the Bashor called out as they shot past a particular standard. Grammaticus turned his head to look and saw Arachne, a mousy but surprisingly large-bosomed girl, if the banner's image was any guide, weaving her complex web of fate and destiny. The insertion point was an outfall of the city's antique sewer system, some 18 kilometers west of the palace. It had been exposed by shelling about 3 months earlier and was well guarded. Apart from the Geno sentries, automated gun servitors watched it, unblinking, day and night. The Nerthine guarded the other end just as proficiently, but Grammaticus wasn't going all the way to the other end. The Bashor introduced him to the point officer, a ruddy-faced hetman called Marino. Marino wanted the servitors to default passive and stood watching with the Bashor as Grammaticus slithered down the shattered embankment into the maw of the outfall. Darkness, as had so often been the case in his life, embraced him. 10 kilometers and 90 minutes later, he pulled himself out of a runoff vent not far from the rising walls and banked towers of Monlo Harbour. He had already switched off his lamp and left it in the bag, along with his canvas jacket and army boots stuffed behind the loose bricks of a culvert. His journey along the dark chute had provided him with almost enough time to complete his identity immersion. He was no longer Konig Henneke. He was Desal Hulter. In all, he had taken very few real measures to disguise himself. A wrap of pink silk over his desert suit, felt shoes in place of the army boots, a desert shawl expertly pulled around his head. His skin was tanned, though not as dark as the average Nerthine, and a strict Nerthine observer of the Parkel would have worn his hair tied in a net under his shawl and anointed his scalp, armpits, groin, and belly with scented oil. Grammaticus never went to such extremes, even though his imperial spy masters recommended he should. He knew that his mind was more than capable of smoothing over most epistemological blemishes. Besides, the anointing oils smacked of a ritual offering to the primordial annihilator, something he was not prepared to undertake. He fastened the hooked knife worn by all Nerthine to his underbelt, then strapped on the broad overbelt with its 3 pouches for fluid, mineral salt, and currency. He washed his hands in the trackside dust to blacken his fingernails. Apart from the knife, he carried no weapon, except, of course, for the ring. The sun was crawling up into the sky, having revealed itself during his trek through the dank underworld. He felt its searing heat on his head and shoulders, but he was near the sea, close enough to both feel and smell it. Fresh winds came in from the harbour shore, snaking in across the desert outland. He sniffed moisture. He began to walk towards the banked towers and enamelled walls of the port city. Others were doing the same. War or no war, life went on. Straggles of traders and merchants, some with trains of pack animals, were heading into Monlo from the hinterland, hoping to do business at the city markets. Migrant workers were walking to the port in search of employment. Refugees and displaced citizens were coming to the gates, fleeing the imperial advance. Grammaticus fell in with them. As he walked, Grammaticus began the psychic litany in his head, the final progression towards immersion in another dialect and culture base. I am John Grammaticus. I am John Grammaticus. I am John Grammaticus pretending to be Konig Henneke. I am Konig Henneke. I am Konig Henneke pretending to be Desal Hulter. I am Desal Hulter. Aiche Desal Hulter lem pretending. Elche Desal Saman Hulter lem Tanayek. Elche Desal Saman Hulter lem Tanayek. Who are you, fellow? One of the Ekvenuth warriors at the city gate asked as he approached. The Equinurth had been resting his falx against his silver breastplate, but now he raised it. Some of his companions did likewise. Others were stopping and searching some water merchants, heading in out of the desert through the ancient arch. "I am Dasal Hulta," Grammaticus replied in demotic Nerthine, making the obeisance of all the sunlight to the Equinurth. "I am a merchant." Falx held ready across the left shoulder to strike. The Equinurth stared at Grammaticus. "Show me your palms, your face, and your brands." Grammaticus made as if to do so. "I'm safe, and you've seen all you need to reassure you," he sent at the same moment. The Equinurth nodded and waved him into the city, already sweeping the incomers for his next subject. Grammaticus had shown him nothing. Monlo was waking up. As a city girded to the expectation of assault, it never truly slept, but its habits followed a circadian ebb and flow. The outer walls were well defended by squadrons of Equinurth, by iron mortars and bombasts, and by platoons of the regular Nerthadra ground troops. They loitered in unruly, spitting gatherings around the heavy steps of the city's thick walls, or stood on the wall's fighting platforms, watching the distant, unmoving enemy through spyglasses. Deeper in the city, the rhythmic pulse of life was easier to discern. Markets woke up, merchants announced their wares, morning devotions were declaimed by strong-lunged priests, water carriers called their services as they wandered the plazas and the winding cobbled streets and lanes. Grammaticus retraced his steps, trying to recall the specific layout of the place as he had experienced it the first time. Passing merchants and elders nodded and made the all-the-sunlight gesture to him as they acknowledged his status. He made the gesture back. Grammaticus wanted to get into the northern suburb, an area called Kurnaul, so he could get a good look at the city's north wall. Tuvi would appreciate his efforts. He stood aside to let a grox cart trundle past. Street washers cleaned the cobbles with bristle brooms and pails of water, using spades for the animal dung. They sang as they worked. The faience-tiled walls of the port city glimmered around him in the morning sun, showing reeds and reptiles in mosaic. The Nerthine had no street names, just pictorial emblems. He looked at a particular symbol, a great monitor lizard delineated in cherry red tiles, and knew with a trained certainty that he had never seen it before. He'd made a wrong turn. Monlo was so complex, so interwoven, it was hard to recall the specific plan. It was like Arachne's web, mousy, big-bosomed Arachne. He was the needle, he fancied, her needle, moving through the net of fate. He halted and took a moment to consider. His internal compass was out. He checked with the rising sun and established where east was. He slowed his breathing and allowed himself to perspire for a minute, just to stabilize his body. He had his bearings again. He'd just gone a street too far west, that was all. Karnal district was over to his left. Except it wasn't. He halted again, refusing to allow panic to dig in. A water carrier came up to him and offered a ladle of water. "No, thank you," Grammaticus said. "God love you anyway," the carrier replied, moving on. Grammaticus shuddered. What the water carrier had actually said, literally translated as, "The primordial annihilator, immolate your living soul." What's wrong with me? Grammaticus thought. Last time I was here, I slipped easily from street to street. This time I'm behaving like an amateur. My head is swimming. This is stupid. He crossed through 2 more busy streets, looking for familiar landmarks. It felt as if Kurnaul district was further away than ever. It was as if something was distracting him, baffling his abilities. On impulse, he reached into the bag of mineral salts hooked to his broad overbelt and closed his fingers around the meme seed hidden in the salt inside. The seed was the size of an earlobe, set into a small silver clasp. Garhet had given it to him. The seeds, fruited from some xenotype tree on a world somewhere in the Cabal's range of influence, were psychically sensitive. If they grew warm or desiccated in any way, it was a sign that psychic activity was close by. Grammaticus looked at the meme seed. It was always a little warm and dry because it reacted to his own talents. In his hand, the seed was positively hot, like a burning coal. It had shriveled in its setting. He was in trouble. The meme seed screamed a